So we're going to start out with the history of the community. First I want to identify where East Towson is. I know many of you know where it is, but we have here a bird's eye view from above of East Towson, and I've got it in red, which might be a little difficult to read. The library is actually right here, if you can see my pointer. So you're practically in East Towson. This is from a map. And the easiest thing is, you know, your East Towson is near the roundabout. So the structures of significance that have survived, this is the list. And what's so interesting, when you drive around or walk around East Towson, it doesn't look like anything. But if you look at it as these artifacts from other eras, St. James AUMP Church is over 160 years old. They have 2 surviving log houses. They have 1 of 3 high schools that under Jim Crow, we'll talk a little bit about it. There's the Elks Lodge, and then several of the homes were built by descendants from enslaved people at Hampton. And then you come to the BG&E Power Substation, along with the widening of Fairmount Avenue. And this was the county's attempt to push blacks out of the county and into the city, along with the electrical power lines. To tell the story of East Towson, we go back to the early formation of Towson in 1703. Most of downtown Towson fits within 2 colonial land surveys, James Meadows and Tracy's Park. But every grant of land from Lord Baltimore's land office to a settler had a name. Each applicant for land first had a survey performed by the land office, and after paying the cost of the land, he was issued a patent and the land was given a name selected by the new owner. Most of the land was surveyed for persons hoping to develop plantations. There were very little residential building in and around Towson until the county government moved here in 1857. And just to take it a step back, which we don't talk about, that the Ridgeleys owned Hampton Plantation. They got the property from Lord Baltimore. But how did Lord Baltimore get the property, and who did he get it from? So I'm not going to answer those questions, but it's really important to keep asking how or why. So we have here where East Towson is, if you can follow the pointer, it's down here in Tracy's Park.
Can't see the pointer going.
Well, I guess it's not showing. So it's right down at the very bottom of the last line there is Jefferson Avenue. So again, the roundabout is where all those farms came together. And that's why you have the roundabout, that it's just a historic, weird collection of property that comes together, and the roundabout seems to be the best way to navigate that. The history of East Towson dates from the purchase of 1¼ acres of land by a freed slave, Daniel Harris, in 1853. He bought a chip out of the far east corner of the Payne property, right on the border of Dr. Stansbury's estate, Uterwood. And this is pretty much it. And if the pointer doesn't show up, which it doesn't seem to be, where's our?
Is there anything we can do with them?
Cody, is there a way of getting a pointer on this? I'm just so unfamiliar with the program.
Maybe the thing?
Their pen and laser pointer tomorrow. Go ahead and choose the laser pointer option. And then
There we go.
There you go.
Great. All right. So we have here It's right over here is oh no, I'm sorry, it's right here. And it says American Church and School. And over here it
African.
says Udawood, which was the former name of Towson Marketplace. So if you've lived here forever, you know that. I also want to say about Daniel Harris. His wife was part of the partnership in living in East Towson, and together they were working and saving money to buy their daughter's freedom, who was enslaved at Hampton. And they were the first documented African-American slaveholders in Towson. And East Towson is amongst the oldest enclave in Baltimore County. Further, manumitted slaves and/or descendants of former slaves, many of whom were owned by Charles Ridgely, eventually populated the neighborhood. Harris allowed the post-Civil War agency, the Freedmen's Bureau, to build a school on his property sometime in the late 1860s, but we'll talk more about that later. The 1877 Atlas, which is this one, showed a church and a school on the Harris property fronting on Hillen Road. So do you want to talk a little bit about this slide?
Oh, the statistics.
Mm-hmm.
So, in this slide is showing you that in 1860, there were 4,231 free blacks, 3,182 enslaved persons. And so this speaks to what we often hear, which is that, well, I didn't own slaves, my ancestors didn't own slaves, and it's important to acknowledge that slave ownership was often a rich person's game. However, in Towson was made up largely of farms. And so while most families didn't own very many slaves, they did own them. Or maybe you just owned a man and a woman, and the thing to keep in mind is that if you owned a man and a woman, then the children born of that union were free slaves to the family who owned them. And what I often like to point out to Carol is that if only 756 people owned slaves, given the number of enslaved persons, you're talking about the average slave owner owning 45 lives apiece on average. Now, we also know that Hampton was an industrial slave plantation, and at the point of manumission in 1830, Ridgely owned 377 slaves, is what one study done at Goucher acknowledges. But that was arguably at a low point, because at one point he owned closer to 600 or 700. I think your thing says 5. And the reduction in the number often comes from what Gregory Weidman shares with us, is that some of the names in their meticulous record keeping was repeated, and so they couldn't guarantee that one Mary and another Mary were not the same Mary. So those are the kinds of things that lead to the disparity in the number.
But also, Hampton has done a huge amount of research, and we'll talk about Hampton in a few minutes. But if you go online to Hampton National Historic Site, they have their ethnographic study on there. You have to hunt around for it. It's very much like the 1619 project that the New York Times did. And people don't realize all that history is out there for the public. Getting back to the development of the neighborhood, most of the houses were on Hillen Road, which is Towson Town Boulevard today, and Pennsylvania Avenue. Development in East Towson did not take off until the late 1800s. Its boundaries were Hillen Road on the south, Virginia on the west, abutting Black & Decker campus on the east, and probably, we think, a little bit of Joppa Road on the north. And now I would like to share with you this excerpt from the former county historian's book, published in 2018. Brooks and Rockall, in their county history, stated that the 1880 census showed 150 black people in Towson. Few of them owned property and thus are not found in the tax list. Hardly any African American had a business of his own. Most people were cooks, builders, washerwomen, maids, gardeners, janitors, and cart drivers.
East Towson developed after emancipation. About half of the black people were already free when the war started. None of the county's enslaved people were set free by the 1863 Emancipation Proclamation. It was the adoption of the 1864 state constitution that ended slavery in Maryland. Yet people who remember the Towson town of 1854 said that there were only about 7 houses in the village, all occupied by white people. One of the links to slavery at Hampton is found in an obituary for Nathan Lyons, or Uncle Nace, who died at his Hillen Road home in 1892. A small black-owned store was Davidge's, which you see here in this image, at the corner of Jefferson and Hillen Road. There was the first schoolhouse, which was dedicated in 1867. Persons interviewed by county historian Lewis S. Diggs recalled a one-room schoolhouse on Jefferson Avenue that was apparently demolished and to build the 1939 George Washington Carver Colored High School. The county paper in the late 19th century reported that Sheriff Butler had built cottages along Hillen Road. These were rental properties, no architectural frills, to be rented to minorities. When interviewed, Mrs. Adelaide Bentley, my grandmother, recalled her childhood of the 1930s. She recalled riding bikes around the courthouse with white kids who joined in the fun. There was a swimming hole near Sandy Bottom where boys of both races swam harmoniously. People of her mother's generation didn't talk about slavery. It was not until late in the century that people began to discuss this evil institution. The grandmothers seem to remember which farms, which is what I mentioned earlier, families had been held on. And of course, before the end of segregation, black people were not allowed in the only movie house in Towson, which was the Towson Theater. Logie Bonnet, the editor of the Jeffersonian, for those of you who remember that paper, in the 1930s used to ridicule the minority population. He called East Chesapeake Avenue, which is where you're sitting right now, the Great Black Way, and published cartoons of stereotype comic strip characters saying silly things. In the civil rights era, the neighborhood had its persistent leaders who spoke out against being paved over for commerce. In recent times, some of the houses have been spruced up so that the neighborhood is gentrifying. The setting of the property, building styles, and construction materials were guided by the limited economic status of the residents and their desire to establish a neighborhood of their own without the assistance of white architects, builders, and craftsmen. By 1927, the community was 95% improved with single-family dwellings, social buildings, a school, a grocery store, and religious structures.
So now I want to talk about the 2 log houses that remain in East Towson. One of the houses was attached, or it was the original house, which in this picture is this black thing. That's a log house made with chestnut logs. And there had been a fire. The house in front of it that it was attached to has since been demolished. The county at this point decided that they would like to preserve this log house. So they decided to deconstruct the remnants of the log house and Then they rebuilt it, and this is one of, if you go today to this house, which is on the grounds of the Carver School, you will see this informational plaque, so I got pictures off of that. They deconstructed the logs, and then they rebuilt them on the grounds of the Carver School, so this shows you the logs without the chinking. And then on opening day, they had quite a little celebration. And if you're lucky to get inside, this is what you see. And it's taken from both directions. It's actually a very small structure. And to think that people could live in such a small space. But there's another log house in Towson that got moved from Jefferson Avenue to Fairmount. And this is what you see if you drive by on Fairmount. And it's another thing I want to mention is that it's the facade of this building is these brown shingles. And brown shingles in the 20s and 30s and 40s before aluminum siding were very popular. And the old pictures in East Towson show many houses with these brown shingles. And you can still, when you're driving around Towson, you can still see a few houses from the 20s and 30s. So if you go through that front door, this is what you're gonna see. And we got these pictures off of Zillow when the house was for sale. So you can see how here is a log house that originally was 3 blocks from York Road. Just amazing.
So with the Jacob House, often when we show it, we say it's a throwback to the tiny house era, but the Jacob House at this point is actually larger than the average tiny house. So East Towson was deliberately established in this location north of Baltimore City because of its proximity to Hampton. This plantation was the most northern of all traditional southern plantations. We'd like to believe the Ridgely family were the were kind to their slaves, but in reality, Hampton could be considered a forced labor camp. This late 18th century dwelling, located on the northeast of East Towson, was one of home to Charles Ridgely and his wife, Rebecca Dorsey. Upon their 28th birthday, manumitted slaves, granted freedom after the death of Ridgely in 1830, chose to establish their residential neighborhood in proximity to their former home. Now, the thing to understand is that if you were younger than 28, so maybe I'm 28 and I'm now free, but maybe I have a child who's 10. My child is still enslaved by the Ridgely family. So am I going to up and leave and go to some distant place? Am I gonna go, let's say, inside the city? Or am I gonna try to stay where my family is? And so those were some of the challenges that the opportunity for freedom presented under these particular circumstances. So the period of slavery at Hampton went from the American Revolution until 1864, when the Maryland state law ended it. At one time, the Ridgleys, the family that owned Hampton and the Northampton Iron Works, owned 500 enslaved persons, from young children to the elderly. They labored as iron workers, founders, limestone and marble quarriers, millers, blacksmiths, gardeners, dairy maids, jockeys, cobblers, seamstresses, woodcutters, child caregivers, field hands, carriage drivers, cooks, cleaners, and builders. All these positions combined to create a community within the plantation in which enslaved people held meetings, lived together, and practiced their religion while simultaneously being subjected to forms of control by overseers and slaveholders. Do you want to share the architecture on that?
Oh, well, what you're looking at is Mrs. Ridgely had gone off to France and she found these wonderful houses, so she decided that she must have them at Hampton, so when she looked out her window, she could see lovely houses. So these are two, not many were built, but the two surviving slave quarters are here, and the log houses on the Hampton Plantation did not survive, and I don't know if they know where they were located, but because there were 25,000 acres at Hampton, they had little villages all over those 25,000 acres. There's some thought that Sandy Bottom, we can't document it, might have been another setting of slave quarters. We aren't sure about that. And so that's...
Okay. So refuge for freedom seekers was much closer for enslaved persons in Hampton than for enslaved persons in the Deep South. Hampton was close to both the free state of Pennsylvania and the city of Baltimore, which had the largest free black population in the country in the years leading up to the Civil War. More than 80 people sought their freedom from Hampton with different goals: escaping punishing conditions, establishing new lives as free persons, or returning to families at other Maryland plantations.
So this program is called From Jim Crow to Black Lives Matter. So when I put this together, I kept saying to myself, I don't understand what Black Lives Matter is. So in my course of research, I came across this very important picture, Am I Not a Man and a Brother? It's called The Kneeling Slave, and if you Google this, you will see lots of interpretations of this. It became kind of the abolitionist symbol. Whoops, I guess that doesn't mean anything. And I always think of it as Colin Kaepernick taking the knee. Did it go back this far? We don't know. I haven't had a chance to talk to him. But it's, you know, the NFL taking of the knee. The other picture I wanted to show you, because I feel this talks so much about what is slavery. And yes, of course I knew what slavery was. But in this picture, which also comes from the Library of Congress, to the left, you see the ship, the slave ship, and here you see some people enslaved, and then you see the seller and the buyer. But over here in the right, you see a woman, and she has two small children chained to her. And that to me is what defines the harshness of slavery. And behind her is the US Capitol. So you wonder, you know, and this picture is dated 1830. Mm-hmm. So, and you can take it.
Oh, okay. So this is Nancy Davis and a young Eliza Ridgely. So Nancy Davis was a woman enslaved at Hampton, and upon manumission, she and her husband stayed on. And Nancy Davis's husband was a chef, and Nancy Davis herself raised 3 generations of Ridgely children. And she is the only African American that we know of who is buried in the family cemetery there.
So we have a couple of pictures that we did screenshots from Gregory Weidman's talk about the genealogy of former enslaved people and their descendants. So this one is about a person who had been enslaved at Hampton and is buried over here in Towson at Pleasant Rest. And here is another, the Gross Harris family tree, and they still live in...
Actually, John Gross has a sister who actually lives on Lenox Avenue. Yeah.
Live in Towson. So it's just amazing to me how we have this direct connection
Okay, so Hampton is also the site of one of the largest, as we mentioned, manumissions in Maryland's history. And at the time of his death in 1829, Charles Carnan Ridgely owned nearly 350 enslaved individuals scattered across several farms, the ironworks, mansion, and his Baltimore townhouse. Isn't that where Ridgely's Delight is, inside the city?
Yep,
Right.
and that's actually where slave pens were. But again, in Baltimore City, you don't see, there's no, identification of the past history of enslavement, which was really important in the city.
In his will, Ridgely granted freedom to female enslaved persons between the ages of 25 and 45, and male enslaved persons between the ages of 28 and 45. Court cases amongst the governor's heirs delayed manumission and the reality that freedom came to some family members but not others, particularly children, which meant that enslaved families faced a difficult choice. Was freedom worth the cost of separation? Children aged 3 to young adults aged 27 were not old enough to be freed, nor were those over the age of 45. This is there's a photograph.
You know,
I've
we already did that.
Okay, so
Sorry.
again, not a problem. So again, this is a percentage of those statistics that less than 1% of, the population owned slaves. And, you know, there's a gentleman who's a former attorney of the ACLU, and he's doing a strong advocacy project around the impact of slavery in America, and he points out that while many could argue that they didn't own slaves, nor did their families, the one thing we know is that none could argue that they had not benefited from discrimination, which of course is a direct byproduct of slavery. So, this is a quote from a New York Times, a quote published by the New York Times, written by Julius Owangwam. It's an excerpt from his college admissions essay. So it says, "But let me paint a picture. Let's say your great-great-grandmother was a newly liberated slave in 1863. How free is she truly? She might be free, but the world still doesn't have to treat her equally. No one is obliged to give her a job. She is the same person she was the week before. And her kids, they are now growing up with a mother who can't read or write, while at the same time struggling to live in a society evolving to house a new race. Are her children supposed to immediately succeed? And what about their children and their children?"
So now we're in the period of Reconstruction, of which we're not going to talk a whole lot about, but again, because of the Black Lives Matter and the death of George Floyd, I found in the Library of Congress this incredible picture where we have a black soldier actually sprawled on the American flag, and he's got 3 different people's feet on him. And this is dated from 1868. So the idea of police having their feet on a black person has been going on probably since the beginning. So now I would like to talk about Jim Crow. Who was Jim Crow? And I'm assuming most people really don't know who Jim Crow is. So Jim Crow was a folk person from a song that was sung, and the theater performer in 1828 based his character on Jim Crow, a folk trickster who had been popular among enslaved black people. There was a traditional slave song called Jim Crow. The character is dressed in rags and wears a battered hat and torn shoes. Rice applied blackface makeup made of burnt cork to his face and hands and impersonated a very nimble and irreverently witty African-American field hand who sang, "Come listen all you gals and boys, I'm going to sing a little song. My name is Jim Crow. Wheel about and turn about and do just so. Every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow." The Jim Crow laws were state and local laws and enforced racial segregation in the southern United States from the late 19th century and early 20th centuries by white Democratic-dominated state legislatures to disenfranchise and remove political and economic gains made by blacks during the Reconstruction period. The Jim Crow laws were enforced until 1965. These laws mandated racial segregation in all public facilities in the states of the former Confederate States of America and in some others, beginning in the 1870s. They were upheld in 1896 in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, in which the U.S. Supreme Court laid out its separate but equal legal doctrine for facilities for African Americans. Moreover, public education had essentially been segregated since its establishment in most of the South after the Civil War. The legal principle of separate but equal racial segregation was extended to public facilities and transportation, including the coaches of interstate trains and buses. Facilities for African Americans were consistently inferior and underfunded compared to the facilities for white Americans. Sometimes there were no facilities for them at all. As a body of law, Jim Crow institutionalized economic, educational, and social disadvantages for African Americans living, it says in my script, in the South, but I would say that the discrimination is pretty universal even today.
Jim Crow laws and Jim Crow state constitutional provisions mandated the segregation of public schools, public places, public transportation, and the segregation of restrooms, restaurants, and drinking fountains for whites and blacks. The U.S. military was already segregated. President Woodrow Wilson, a Southern Democrat, initiated the segregation of federal workplaces in 1913. In 1954, segregation of public schools, state-sponsored, was declared unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice Earl Warren in landmark case Brown versus Board of Education. In some states, it took many years to implement this decision, while the Warren Court continued to rule against Jim Crow laws in other states. Generally, the remaining Jim Crow laws were overruled by the by the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Another historical remnant or artifact in East Towson from the era of Jim Crow is the Carver Colored High School, pictured there. And it had started out actually as a school for all kids. I learned actually last year that I have neighbors who went to first and second grade in that building. So essentially, the historical plaque calls it a high school because evidently that's what it was by the time it closed due to integration.
Okay. The Freedmen's Bureau, established by Abraham Lincoln in 1865, was really the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, usually referred to as the Freedmen's Bureau. It was a government agency from 1865 to 1872, which is the period of Reconstruction, to provide direct provisions, clothing, and fuel for the immediate and temporary shelter and supply of destitute and suffering refugees and freedmen and their wives and children. The Freedmen's Bureau was an important agency of early Reconstruction, assisting the freed people in the South. The school was established in 1857 to provide an education for Towson's African American community. The first classes were held in an unused army barracks that had been transported to the site on Hillen Road. Money to support the school would be privately raised, as Baltimore County would not appropriate money for the reconstruction of African American schools until 1897. In the 600 square miles of Baltimore County, all black high school students were bused to one of three schools, either Carver in the center, Solars Point on the east, or Banneker on the west. And if you wanted to graduate your 12th year of high school, you had to go into the city. It only went through the 11th grade.
So, we're going to introduce you to a few people who are from East Towson. The first was Albert Castle. Albert was an architect. He was born in Towson. His family later moved. He was the son of a coal wagon driver. His father also Albert Castle and his wife Charlotte. And attended school. His father and mother attended school in East Towson. Young Castle, born in 1895, became a noted architect, which is why we show you this image, a noted architect who practiced in Washington, D.C. and designed some of the buildings at Howard University, as well as Morgan State University. He headed the Department of Architecture at Howard, and here's a building he was most proud of. And if you can remember Providence Hospital, he designed that also.
Yeah.
Oh, and then we have
We found another person.
Right, that's exactly. So Billy Jones definitely grew up in Towson, actually on the same street that I live on now. He was the first African American to break the ACC color line in basketball at the University of Maryland College Park. And so I think it was 2020, the university renamed its Hill Fieldhouse after Bill Jones and Darrell Hill. Darrell Hill did the same thing for football at the University of Maryland. And so this building, this new athletic center commemorates their achievement.
So the last part of our talk is environmental racism in East Towson, which is when you're walking around the neighborhood, one of the artifacts that you see today. The term environment is a term understood as it sets where everything takes place. The environment is defined as where we live, work, play, learn, and pray. Most people want equal access to work, recreation, education, religion, and safe neighborhoods. The racial dimension of environmental inequality surfaces around the question of who has rights to environmental protection and who bears the burden of waste and pollution. Environmental racism can be traced back around 500 years with the arrival of the Europeans and their displacement of Native Americans. Environmental racism can also be identified through sociological theories in which covert organized racial and ethnic oppression develops into environmental injustices, or overt racism, which limits the right of people of color to make decisions with regard to the environment in which they live. And sadly, this goes on today in East Towson. So maybe you want to talk about the train?
Oh, that one? Okay. So this is a rendering of the Ma Railroad. This train is a sort of pictorial of this train coming through Towson. The thing that I think is important to note is that when it was originally, the original concept of the Ma Railroad did not cut through the neighborhood. It actually went along what is now Joppa Road, which meant it would not have disrupted the neighborhood at all. But by the time it was actually built, it cut right through the neighborhood. And so Towson Town Boulevard, which is what you which is what it is today, was the train line for the Monopile Railroad. And so this monstrous vehicle, and you can see on the side, at first when I saw these pictures, I thought those guys were children. And then it dawned on me the train was so big that they were actually men. And so it cut right through. You can see the houses on the other side of the street, and Carol has another image where you can see the Carver School, which still looks like that. The Carver School still looks like that in the train coming through, and that train ran through Towson sometimes up to 16 times a day.
Actually, when you go here at the library on the circular walkway, there is a picture of this train going over York Road. It's sort of a very historic picture.
And I think the trestle, one of the trestles still sits across the street from the library at the
They're
corner.
kept as a historic.
Yeah,
Yes.
when they built Whole Foods, they
Yes.
left that up and
They
actually.
saved-
Well, actually, Historic Towson saved
Yeah,
the railroad abutments, and I always think of them as the gates to the medieval city.
Well, but it's also, highways and things are still run through
Yes,
lower income
Oh, yeah.
predominantly.
absolutely.
And we'll get to that,
Yeah.
because that happened on Fairmount Avenue in East Towson.
Mhm.
So I'm not quite sure why the USGS map is here, but it's what it looked like in 1944.
Right.
Do you wanna?
Sure, this is, Black and Decker, which actually is my neighbor. It sits at the bottom of the hill. Actually, Black and Decker came to this particular area because of the Monopile Railroad. It made it easier for them to receive and ship supplies at the time. I think, they've been in Towson since maybe 1910, and I didn't even realize they had been here that long. That gate you see, when I was a kid, was not there. So I guess you could say as sort of as a way of being a good community partner or neighbor, that gate was not there, and we could still access Joppa Road without having to go to Fairmount Avenue and kind of work our way around, because our access to Joppa Road was kind of cut off by the building of their campus. However, many years ago now, they closed it off, and there's a traffic light at the opening so that it's easy for their employees to traffic in and out. But it used to be an enormous procession of cars through the community every day at 4 o'clock. But another perspective on environmental racism argues that there are 4 factors which lead to environmental racism. Chief among them are lack of affordable land, lack of political power, lack of mobility, and poverty. So this image shows you what houses and housing looked like in East Towson during the same exact time that housing looked like this in Southwood Hills. So that's an image of the disparity. So cheap land is sought by corporations and governmental bodies as a result of communities which cannot effectively resist these corporations and governmental bodies, and cannot access political power, cannot negotiate just costs. Communities with minimized socioeconomic mobility cannot relocate. So a lack of financial contributions also reduced the community's ability to act both politically, physically, and politically.
So in 1964-65, there had been a very large vacant lot in the middle of East Towson. And the rumor is, which we think is correct, that this is where the Negro leaders may have either played or practiced baseball. But a land speculator owned that property, and probably because Spiro Agnew was the county executive, probably passed a little money back and forth under the table, and the property was then bought by BG&E for the power substation, and that was a direct way of pushing blacks out of Towson. And so in order to, get enough property for the power substation, they demolished several houses. Here you can see that block with the parcel in the middle, and here are some of the houses that were destroyed. And so, from just about anywhere in the neighborhood, you can drive around and you will see the power substation.
It sits on 2.5 acres of land and is either the front or backyard view for 4 of the 6 remaining blocks of East Towson.
And then they got the bright idea to widen Fairmount Avenue as a cut through to the Beltway. So this is the intersection on Fairmount where Pennsylvania crosses. And I like to say that the neighborhood got sliced and diced, and this is one of them. So just above this intersection is where they widened, and who knows how many houses they demolished. But they could only afford to widen 2 blocks. So, and then there's a couple of office buildings that were built there. Another thing about the environment in East Towson is that they built apartment houses way too tall. So this is the Ridgely Towers, and it overwhelms the viewscape in the neighborhood. And again, you can see it here. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about this. So we have an issue that is going on today that is a civil rights issue where a person owns the only vacant lot in East Towson who wants to make some money off of it. And so it's pending, it's been tied up in the courts for some time to build affordable housing unit that was not only cheaply designed, but it's just much too large for that parcel. So this is the aerial view of Red Maple Place, and this is the drawing of the side of Red Maple Place, and this is what Red Maple Place looks like from Joppa Road. It just would overwhelm the neighborhood. In the back, where it would be abutting East Pennsylvania, it would be 7 stories tall and rather narrow. So it's just, what were they thinking of? Plus, to build affordable housing in a neighborhood that's already affordable housing. And I will say, we have tried very hard to get this to not happen. And we've written a lot to the county executive, and he hears us. But until it's decided in the courts, he's not going to be very helpful. So do you want to talk about East Towson today? Or?
Sure. Actually, if you could go back to the one with the grass, the trees, I'm sorry. So this wooded lot extends from Pennsylvania Avenue straight through to Joppa Road. The original address for Red Maple Place was 413 East Pennsylvania Avenue. Right, the white building that you see, yes, is actually the Elks Lodge, which has, that building's been there for 95 years, and the Elks is the oldest and only social club in East Towson. So that big building would have been sitting right next to the Elks Lodge. So it was actually pushback from the community that had the developer flip the address to 405 East Joppa Road. Number 1. This parcel is not only the only remaining green space in East Towson, it's the only remaining green space in Towson from here to White Marsh. It sits at the headwaters of the western branch of the Herring Run. It's situated literally on top of a stream. And the engineer has no real requirement, because the county favors development. It has no real requirement for stormwater runoff. If you pave it over, that water doesn't daylight again until Egbert Avenue, which means if water rolls downhill, and we know it does, then the problem may start in East Towson, but it won't end there. Now, somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 to 6 homes were lost to flooding on Stevenson Avenue, probably not even, barely 5 years ago. And so it looks like it's an East Towson problem, but I assure you that the gravity of the issue will spread. And our feeling is that if that land that the Mangione family has owned since 1983, if it was developable, it would already be developed. There's in the pictures that Carol has of East Towson today, you'll see signs for a community called Harris Hill, which is a lovely little condo and townhouse development that was built back in the 90s. I think it's maybe 29 years old this year. It was conceptualized to have African American families who had to leave Towson because of zoning that sort of cornered them out generation after generation to come back. However, when Harris Hill was completed, of the 53 units that were built, only 5 or 6 went to African American families. The rest of it was completely white. And now they do boast a more diverse community. They certainly do have a more diverse community, but still only about 5 of those units have African American families in them. So this is actually Railroad Avenue. And if you live on Railroad Avenue, your view, as I mentioned earlier, is only the BGE substation. So
and they landscaped it with this beautiful fence.
and tree.
And tree.
Yeah. So, so the East Towson community continues to, in whatever way we can, continue to push on. We're down to 6 blocks, and we're working to preserve what's left of what is clearly a history, not only a local history, but a national history. One of the things I like to say to Carol is, though we don't focus on Reconstruction, the bottom line is you have Jim Crow because Reconstruction was working. And Black people were upon their freedom, after all those years of brutal subjugation, they managed to just jump right into freedom and make the best of their lives as they could, but maybe they just went about, they were too good at it, I guess. They were too good at it. So that greenhouse that you just passed, Carol, is one of the houses in the neighborhood that was built in 1910, and the original family still lives in it. There's another one down the street from it, belongs to the Mack family, and the great-grandfather was a child slave at Hampton, and he built the house that his family still lives in today. So those kinds of things, those kinds of structures, deep family with deep roots are still very much in the community. My own family has been in Towson, I believe I'm the 7th generation. We mentioned earlier that my grandmother said that her mother's generation never talked about slavery, so my grandmother and I were very close. And so I said to her one time, so Grandma, who's your grandma? Because I didn't know her, right? And so she said, Mama's mother, Annie. She says, Annie was Mama's mother. She said, we always believed Annie was a slave, but Mom would never talk about it. So it was actually after a conversation with Gregory Weidman, who's the curator at Hampton National Historic Site, who slid me a genealogical flowchart with my family's information on it. It was like, what? So I have ancestry in Towson by virtue of enslavement at Hampton documented back to 1791. So it not only showed, so the one thing I learned that unfortunately I was never able to share with my grandmother because she passed when I learned it, that Annie actually was not born a slave. She was born in 1880, so 15 years or so after slavery happened, but still living a difficult life, I'm sure. So Annie was one of 18 children. Her parents and their parents were enslaved at Hampton. And 18 children says to me that Annie was one of 18 children who were bred as slaves. So it was not uncommon for the Ridgeleys to not only have slaves, but create families because the offspring of those families were slaves they didn't have to purchase.
So we have a bunch, just a few more, pictures to show you, but there's always some fact that we didn't put in our talk. So the one thing I want to leave you with is that how East Towson came to be so populated was that when the slaves at Hampton were freed, the Ridgely family then divided up their land so that the former enslaved people could become tenant farmers. And after a generation or two, they realized they could not make a decent living. So they drifted off from the plantation, and many of them came into Towson. And that there are other communities in Towson we don't see anymore, Sandy Bottom, but it basically was the triangle where Joppa Road and York Road is, that goes north on the other side of the hill here. And I don't know why I've got these pictures stuck in the back here, but then there's Schwartz Avenue down by the York Road Giant. The Schwartz Avenue was probably started by people who worked for an estate at the corner of Giddings and Walker Avenue and York Road that was called Drumcastle. So today the name Drumcastle lives in those apartments, but it was a beautiful house. And all along York Road and Charles Street and all over the county were farms and estates. So you get pockets of people that could get to work easily. So that concludes our talk, and if there are any questions, if you know of any other groups that would like to hear our talk, we'd love to keep giving it.
Yeah, I
And we
would.
thank you for coming.
Yeah, I'd be, thank you.
I have a question.
Sure.
I actually have a comment and a question. You had spoke earlier about the Ridgely's manumitted some of their enslaved people,
Yes.
but not the children.
Mhm.
That was primarily because there was a law that would not allow slave owners or enslavers to free anyone over the age of 45.
Right.
And you know why that?
Because it was a habit that once the slave got old, they could no longer work, were no longer useful, they would let them go, and they would become charges in the community. So they fast forward against
That's
that.
right.
And then they did the same for children as well, who couldn't take care of themselves. But my question is, I did some research on the history of the Towson YMCA. What was the relationship of the Towson Y and East Towson?
As far as I knew, there was a orphanage back there.
No, I understand the history of the Towson Y. What was the relationship between the Towson Y and your community?
I'm sure there was no relationship.
Right, until after, when I was a kid, by then, the doors were open, a lot of the kids in my neighborhood, learned to swim there.
Okay.
But even now, the funny thing about that is, so we have a summer camp, we've had it for probably over 20 years now. And there used to be a nice sort of synergy between the summer camp and the Y, but now the Y has decided that they don't want any outside camps coming to swim there, on the basis of them having their own camps, but they've always had their own camps. So we are now looking for, and certainly if anybody knows of a swim club or a pool who is willing to allow us to come and swim at least once a week in the month of July, I would love to know about that, because the Y, we're no longer welcome at the Y.
Well, did you try the Jordan Y?
No, I haven't.
You should try the Jordan Y.
Okay.
That used to be called the Colored Y when it was open.
That's right.
In 1896,
That's
and they
right.
still have a more inclusive outreach program, and they would, I think, love to entertain talking to you about that.
Okay.
There's a small private cemetery that's
kind of enclosed between the new Cinemark, theater and what used to be, was it Bobby Place?
Yes, Bobby Flakes, yes.
Were they East Towsoners? Were they-
No.
No?
No, was it part of the, not sure.
It was, Shealy
Shealy, that's
Shealy Cemetery,
Yeah.
and there were white people, and there were descendants in the eastern part of the county that really wanted to keep that cemetery. So when they built whatever that stuff is up there, they had to work around the cemetery.
The black, people are largely buried at Pleasant Rest, but the Pleasant Rest Cemetery did not come online until the 1920s. And so there is some question, curiosity about where black people were buried before then. I happened to be at Hampton taking a walk because their campus is pretty open, especially during COVID. And so I went back, I actually went out of curiosity to see if I could see Nancy Davis's gravesite. Back then, it was COVID, so the gates were still locked. And a woman is walking her dogs and she says, "Oh, you know, there's people buried all around here too." And I was like, "What?" She says, "Yeah, they really need to do some GRP or ground penetrating radar." She says, "Cause there's people buried all out here." And, last year, I met with a woman by the name of Pam Shashi, who was doing some work at the Carroll Mansion. And she shared with me that it wasn't uncommon for a slave to be buried right where he dropped dead. And so she had hoped to do some investigation. She wanted to do some ground penetrating radar right around the front door of the Carroll Mansion. And when she tried to get that specific, they shut her project down. So, and there was another place on that land that she wanted to investigate. And the next thing you know, she says mysteriously they decided they needed a parking lot over there. So even as you know, maybe many of you have seen, on 60 Minutes, they did an expose on highways and shopping centers that had been built over, cemeteries of African American people. The Laurel Cemetery on, I think it's Bel Air Road.
Bel Air Road.
Yes, is a shopping center that's built over a prominent African American cemetery. Supposedly the graves were moved out to Carroll County, and if you go out there, you can see that the headstones are out there, but you would never believe there were bodies under them because they're just situated. They're not situated in a way that's consistent with genuine burial.
But they did move the United States Colored Troops,
Okay.
right there to the Laurel Cemetery.
Okay.
I'm sorry, to the cemetery on Frederick Avenue.
Oh, got it. Okay, the military.
The Baltimore National Cemetery, yeah.
So I want to encourage you, if you haven't been to Hampton, they have a wonderful component that speaks to the enslaved people there. And at some point, Nancy and I are going to go over the Eastern Shore and look at Solder Lake Plantation. But the difference between the Eastern Shore enslavement and Baltimore County is much different because of the geographical location here, and it wasn't tobacco growing, or there were areas that grew tobacco, but primarily this area was really the furnace at Hampton and agriculture. But you've got this direct connection from Hampton into East Towson, which I don't know any other enclave in the state of Maryland has. And to me, it's just an incredible story.
Right. So right now, our way of developing a commemorative and positive response to this otherwise complicated and difficult history is to create a trail that takes us from Hampton to Historic East Towson. So we're calling it the Road to Freedom Trail from Historic Hampton to Historic East Towson. and it will include 13 sites of historic significance that you've seen on this virtual tour that will connect the two places and essentially reveal a history hidden in plain sight. It's like Carol said, if you just meander through the neighborhood, nothing will really click for you if you don't have the history. That's the interesting thing about history. It's so funny, I had a moment this morning, I took my mom to GBMC for a test. So GBMC is doing some construction. And so I was sitting in radiology, a friend was trying to call me and it wasn't working, so I said, wait a minute, let me go to the door. Well, the door is gone because they have closed it off, and if you didn't know, you wouldn't know that there was ever a door there. So I see the woman, the welcoming person sitting at the admissions desk, and I said, wasn't there a door here? And she says, oh yeah. So I said, great. I opened my phone and called my friend because I knew I'd get signal because this is where the door was, and surely enough, the phone came right on it. And I thought, you know what, Nancy? That's history in action. If you didn't know GBMC and you didn't know that there was a door there, then you wouldn't stop there to consider that you could get signal. And so that's a small way that we could possibly interact with history, but to come through East Towson with the benefit of this tour, and Bradley, of course, has been on, and Barbara have been on our actual tours, our Doors Open Baltimore tour, where you can connect this history at least at the point of East Towson. All of a sudden, it's like there's a there, as they say. And so you're able to connect the dots on the history, and all of a sudden, there's something worthy of preservation. And, you know, even at the executive level of government, I had a liaison from John Olszewski's office say, well, we didn't know. And consider, we didn't know, and John Olszewski went to Goucher and studied history. So it's all in what part of history you're studying, right? So I said to her, I said, listen, we are not Black people who got good jobs and moved to Towson. We've always been here. The community was established at least 3 years before county government was established. And then, of course, obviously from this talk, you know, there were people here even before that. So, you know, I think that there's a lot of opportunity, especially when you use nature and allow people to encounter and take in the history on their own in a non-threatening way. I think it's a fantastic opportunity for not just African-American tourism in the area, but also ecotourism, because our trail will stretch from East Towson to Hampton or vice versa, and you've got to be able to get across 695. And so our plan is for there to be a land bridge that reconnects those two campuses, because there was a time when there was obviously no 695 and you could just walk right across the land from one space to another, because Goucher, of course, was part of Hampton, the Epsom Farm. So I think that, you know, it opens up a fantastic opportunity for education, public history, public archaeology, public art, symposiums on the history. It puts Baltimore County and its history on the map in some very powerful and I think constructive ways. And so you can see the brochure on our website. If you go to historiceasttowson.org, under Freedom Trail, it gives you a sort of a summary of the project. We are currently in the feasibility study stage of it, so we're working with the Neighborhood Design Center, and we just completed our 3rd meeting with them this past Monday, and that study should be wrapped up by June, which will determine whether it is in fact a feasible project for the land mass that it covers, and we're excited about it. We're excited about it. I invite you to go to the website, sign up. We'll keep you posted on what's happening there. There are a lot of excited people who are interested. Kent Devereaux, who's the president of Goucher College, is an avid cyclist and loves the idea. John Olszewski is also I would want to call him a partner in the idea. He certainly divided on the issue of the affordable housing project that kind of brought this whole thing to life. I had Barbara Hopkins, who was then the director of Neighborspace, says, well, if you don't want Red Maple there, what do you want? And I said, I'm trying to figure out why there isn't a trail that connects these two places, because you don't have one without the other. And quite frankly, Hampton is being celebrated for its Georgian architecture and downplayed for the fact that it was an industrial slave plantation. And yet it's being funded and cared for and kept up with federal, state, and probably local dollars. So if it's worth preserving, then how come we don't want to know about the people who helped build it? We're either proud of this history or we aren't. And if we aren't willing to tell the whole story, we can't lift up half of it. We can't lift up half of it. You know, you can't, what's that old saying? Behind every great man, there's a great woman, right? And so, you know, so now women are much more in the forefront, and we know who these people's wives are. We know who, you know, raised these fantastic children. And so America was built on some pretty complicated and painful stuff. But I think that if we face it, we can transcend it in some really healthy, positive ways.
Well, I just came back from 10 incredible days in Rome, and one of the things I noticed